Today we're going to be talking about Luckin Coffee, which is a developing story, but quite fascinating in terms of what's going on and the information that's publicly available. I'm joined today by Evan DeFord, who heads up Inflo's Audit Centre of Excellence. We're recording on May the 4th. And at this point in time, Evan, what have we been able to identify from the background research and the information that's been disclosed by Luckin Coffee and others in the market?
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. Let me jump into it. So like anybody, my first kind of initial reaction when I kind of started seeing all the buzz about Luckin was to go to their website. So I'm going to share my screen. So I went out to Luckin and really landing on their homepage. It's all in Chinese, but I did notice that their effectively investor relations was in English. And so when I jumped out to that, obviously you can kind of see all of their filings. And the reason for that is because Luckin, as we know very high level, is a Chinese company, but they are listed on NASDAQ as an ADR. And we've seen that a lot lately, right? In the last several years with tech companies, specifically out of China, being listed on US exchanges. And, there's no real need for this to get into specifically the regulatory environment, but effectively when we see that, that's really mainly driven because of one reason. I think until, early of this year, 2020, there was a rule in China that you couldn't be a listed company in China unless you had net profit. So any companies that had net losses, so that really targets startup companies or tech companies specifically, weren't allowed to really be listed. And so an easy avenue was to go to a US exchange. Not to mention it's a great way to get access to foreign investors and kind of the US capital structure. So going out to their website, you can very quickly see that they've had quarterly earnings. They show that they are listed. But in here and jumping in, I wasn't really getting the full picture. So I went to kind of the tried and true in the US, going through the SEC's Edgar search tool. And I won't get into the ins and outs of Edgar, how to do that. That's not a tutorial, but very quickly, I want to kind of start boxing in what I was able to find out. And so when I look at, for instance, Luckin, and I went and found them quite easily, you'll notice that they actually only have a handful of filings. And so I was very quickly able to kind of bookend their timeline. Specifically, they had this most recent filing that really identified and notified the public that there was fraud or suspected fraud, all the way down to effectively their initial registration filing, which I could see was in here about the time of it originally listed in early February of 2019 to become effective in the middle of the year, May 2019. Driving a little bit further, let's look into some of the registration statement and the financial information that's in there, just to get a better sense of their background. So going in and looking at the overview of Luckin, I was able to very quickly understand that, again, they were incorporated and started in 2017, in October to be specific. And from October 2017, with their business model, which really specifically is driven to undercut Starbucks effectively, right? Being able to deploy coffee shops all over China to have, high quality but cost-effective coffee and other products. They've effectively been able to grow to quite a large magnitude and scale. Effectively, as of September 30th, which is the last quarter and quarter to date and year to date financials that are out on their website in the registration, they were able to grow that to effectively 3,600 stores in 43 cities and 30.7 million cumulative transactions, which again, that's a lot. And being able to drill down a little bit further to understand how they're doing that, you can tell that coffee is their main bread and butter. Specifically how they're doing that with technology, they're really using technology to provide a completely 100% mobile or technology-driven service, meaning it's 100% cashless, as well as they say that it's 100% cashierless, right? That you go in and through kind of a algorithm-driven app, they can effectively identify, your behaviors, your trends, what you're going to buy, and even they can play back to a pretty intense voucher and coupon system based on the individual habits of each customer. So you can see that they have multiple different store offerings. And that's one thing that kind of jumped out to me is they do have something in the kind of technology space of they're going in and rather just putting in a store and having people come to them, they're effectively using a hierarchy or triage method of coming in and having delivery kitchens, meaning they're solely delivering coffee based on mobile orders. All the way up is once they identify volume is significant, they actually start putting in true brick and mortar for what they call their kind of pickup stores, where you can come in and very quickly pick up your coffee, and then relax stores, which are more what we think about in the US and UK of having a true place where you can sit down in that coffee shop and experience your coffee, among other things. So again, on the surface, it looks like a relatively viable business model. There's a lot of business models that are like that out there in the market. But what's interesting is when you start looking at the numbers, right? Like I said at the beginning of this, the growth has been pretty exponential, and you see even their kind of figures to date as far as the transactions that they've had, as well as the dollars that they've driven through that. It's significant, right? Effectively having 54% increases of the customers and their repurchase rates, all the way down to even driving further in some of their most recent financial numbers, really looking at not only the growth and expansion of the stores, but just the volume and the amount of volume that they're doing in per transactions at each individual store. So that really gives us the sense of who they are and what they're doing. But I do want to bring it back to some of the press releases and why we're even talking today, Mark.
Yeah, and I think the key press release that's really brought this to many people's attention was on April 2nd when Luckin put out the press release around the identification of inappropriate behavior, misconduct in the business, and fabricating certain transactions. So could you perhaps elaborate a little bit in terms of what you found specifically about this misconduct, Evan, based on the information that we can see from a publicly available standpoint? And just to stress, we don't know anything more than the publicly available information, but what have you been able to glean from that information, Evan?
Yeah, Mark, and I think that's important, right? You brought up that everything that I'm talking about and effectively showing today, which we'll provide links kind of as a supplementary piece to this for anybody that wants to go and kind of look at this further. All of this is public knowledge, right? So there's nothing proprietary. There's nothing that we've done that or people we've talked to that isn't available to anybody else. So to that announcement, right, Mark, you brought up, and very specifically in here, it talks about, that misconduct. But it further elaborates that just beyond kind of the chief operating officer and some associates or some people or employees reporting to him in that misconduct, which is extremely vague, but it goes on to a step further to specifically talk about the scale and the magnitude. And in here, right, they talk about that this investigation, as of now, or when this was released, that they were able to identify, and effectively all of the periods presented in their financial statements to date, that 2.2 billion RMB, which really equates to, I think, 301 million USD of fictitious sales, which is quite impressive when you jump back to kind of that summary financial information that we talked about and showed on screen earlier. Because that 301 million, when I compare that to really looking at their sales for 3 quarters to date for the 9 months ended, that effectively, and again, we don't have insight into how that makes up their sales mix, but effectively you could say that that's wiping out the to date numbers for their truly freshly brewed coffee. So that's all of their coffee and tea sales to date are effectively fictitious, that volume, right? So again, when we talk about scale and magnitude, that's kind of shocking to me, right? Yeah, it's shocking to have fraud or suspected fraud to uncover these things, but when you start talking about numbers of that size, that's dumbfounding, right? And again, it's a little misleading and it's hard to tie in, because one of the things I realize is in that kind of press release, they talk about that that's a number that's been identified through Q4 as well, which that has not been presented to date, right? Again, just to kind of remind everybody, everything that we're seeing from financial numbers, this has all been part of the registration, right? So that quarterly information is unaudited. It's in there. Yes, it's effectively reviewed as part of the process from external auditors, but really the first big financial statement release that would have been audited would have been their 12/31/2019 or year-end financial statements, which this came out in advance of, notifying the public that this suspected fraud had kind of been discovered. So I think when we bring it up and when you start tying in, and of course hindsight is great, I think one of the things you bring up in my old kind of auditor mindset is, should this have been caught? Could this have been caught? How does the role of the auditor really fit in, right? And I think that's something you and I, Mark, have specifically talked about, right? Of, is this something that should the finger be pointed at the auditor? And I know with kind of recent going-ons, and I think it's a little bit different for every geographic region that we've encountered, but it's all kind of the same, singing from the same hymn sheet as far as everyone's first and very quickly to point the finger at the auditor, right?
Well, I think certainly from the UK perspective, in the United Kingdom, throughout 2019, there were a number of reviews performed of the audit market and the audit product on the back of some quite high-profile corporate failures. And one of those reviews, led by Sir Donald Brydon, really looked at the role and purpose of the audit process. And clearly, as part of that process, fraud was a very key topic for discussion in terms of what is the auditor's role in the identification of fraud in corporate business. And another piece that was really articulated by Sir Donald quite well, I thought, was that not all corporate failures or fraud, high-profile fraud cases, are necessarily to be laid at the blame to be laid at the door of the auditors. There is a lot of other reasons and other bases behind such a thing. Yes, in some instances, more could be done. But is this a case, Evan, based on your research, that you think that the auditors of Luckin Coffee could or should have done more? Or to that, is there any other red flags out there in the market based on the background research that you've done that would point to Luckin Coffee being quite a high-risk entity in terms of the risk of fraud in the business?
Yeah. So to that's interesting, right? Because in the actual press release that brought this to everyone's attention, they do point out that this was brought to the board's attention during the audit of the financial statements for the year end. So, do we know, did the auditors, could they have done more? Did they do enough? We don't really know. It's inconclusive right now, but it seems like, right, if this is in the press release, it makes it seem like this was kind of discovered upon kind of procedures that they were performing. Well, it'll be interesting to hear as this progresses, if anything comes to that. But an extension of that, of when we kind of take a step back, and again, there were things that jumped out to me kind of going through the registration statement. And outside of kind of just taking the step back and saying, well, looking at it and beyond kind of the operating model and some of their loyalty practices. And when you start saying, tech company has algorithm for determining, right? When you kind of get outside of some of the shroudedness of that, there was a really interesting anonymous report that, quite honestly, I hadn't really heard about until kind of looking further and researching further and all of those kind of those market postings. But what's interesting about this is, I think from the analyst following Luckin Coffee, there was a lot of, good praise, right? It was kind of hailed as this overthrow to Starbucks in China was going to, overcome them as far as size, volume, et cetera. And there were a lot of people that were backing that, right, from some relatively reputable institutions. But then I came across this, right, that happened in early February. Excuse me. So to say it with concision, there was a short seller report that came out that hit, I think, early January of 2020, and then a press release from Luckin Coffee kind of playing back to that, saying that effectively they identified that this report came out and everything in there they thought was completely flawed, that effectively this short seller was truly just trying to stimulate and kind of cause the market to effectively play into their option position and their short selling position. But now with hindsight, as you kind of look at the keynotes in here, it appears that a lot of these things actually are true or could be true, right? When we start talking about, you look at some of these and saying that, between Q3 and Q4 and Q2 of 2019 to Q4, that potentially there was inflated or fictitious transactions based on what they've subsequently come out, Luckin Coffee themselves, and said that they've uncovered. It appears that a lot of this might actually be true. So, I went to try to kind of look and find this so-called report. And I'll be honest, there were a couple of links that I wasn't comfortable clicking on just based on kind of the URLs. But what I was able to see is high level that apparently was a pretty in-depth review and report, effectively an 89-page report that employed tons of people to effectively sit in and record video in Luckin coffee stores across China, something to the amount of like 11,000 hours of video to actually identify, what were the average daily transactions occurring at the store and what were the product mix or how much was actually going into the individual transactions, to then undermine and come back to kind of understand and analyze that compared to the historic financials that were in that registration. So again, some interesting things that have come out there. But again, does this play into what the auditors found? Does it go in tandem? We don't really know as of right now.
Oh, it's really interesting, Evan, and I think it's the press release specifically cites that the board, these issues were brought to the board's attention as a result of the financial audit of the consolidated financial statements. So I think that's a positive indicator here in terms of the role of the auditor, but we don't know the precise details on this. Clearly, that short selling report was a significant red flag, and the auditors' planning procedures, I'm sure, would have been identifying those kind of reports out there and being able to factor that into the audit approach. It's something that I'm sure we can delve into a bit more detail on in the future in terms of the audit approach for looking for generally this particular type of fraud. But I think today that's been a fantastic and a fascinating insight into what we know of Luckin Coffee at this point in time, and what I'm sure is going to be a developing story as we learn and hear more about it. So thank you very much for the insights you've shared with me and others here today. And I'm looking forward to talking about this issue more as it develops in the coming months.